Today, we're going to rush through 4 issues of New Fun from numbers 3 through 6. Cover dates April 1935 to October 1935. No, your math skills aren't wrong. New Fun struggled to get out on a monthly basis. In our previous episodes, we've analyzed 5 features from this anthology title. This time, let's recap what's been going on in some of the features up through number 6, both ones we already know and ones we haven't talked about yet. In Don Drake on the planet Saro, Don, Betty, and 4 of the midget men have been taken prisoner by the Ant People. The Ant People live in a vast underground cavern ruled not by a queen of their own kind, but by the many-armed beast we glimpsed in episode 3. One blast of Don's disintegrator ray at point-blank range, and the beast is dead. Even though the midget men already told Don that the Ant People aren't dangerous, Don kills his way through them anyway and out of the caverns. Trying to reach the midget men's city of Zetruria, they have to pass through the Valley of the Winged Death. Here, a beautiful Amazon sentry riding a winged giant insect mount is captured when they kill her mount from underneath her. The midget men want to kill her too, but Don spares her life and claims her as a captive, just as a swarm of more Amazons riding giant flying bugs arrive. Don keeps shooting their mounts and killing them, but the Amazons are dangerous too, even with their primitive weapons, so it all drags out until a second many-armed beast arrives. When Don kills it, the Amazons are so grateful that they escort everyone to Zetruria. But while touring the city is attacked by a humanoid giant, Gorodon, the man-eating giant of Saro, that coincidentally targets Don and Betty. But once again, a giant is no match for a disintegrator pistol at point-blank range, and Don is celebrated as a hero again. We learn that while all the men in Zetruria are comical-looking midgets, the women look like sexy elves. The action happens fast and furious, too fast even for dialogue sometimes. We're still firmly in Buck Rogers territory here. Buck fought Amazons too, only on Venus instead of Saro. In Sandra, the Secret Service, Sandra is on her way to the country of Gavonia, ruled by a mad scientist with a death ray. On board the transatlantic steamer, Sandra is warned not to continue to Gavonia, which is then followed by an attack on her in her cabin. She is overpowered 2-1 by Gavonian spies and taken off the ship when they dock in a rolled-up carpet. The men who warned Sandra are actually Lothar and Reynolds, 2 American agents on her side, and they figure out what happened to Sandra and speed in a taxi after them. They attack the driver, which is misunderstood by the locals, and a huge brawl ensues. During the chaos, Sandra manages to reach the gun of one of the spies and holds them both prisoner. For a while it looked like Lothar and Reynolds were going to take over being the stars of the strip, but Sandra acquits herself well when she's not being captured. In Spike's Spalding, the little boy Spike thinks that he only dreamed seeing 2 men dressed all in black in his room, but the 2 men are real and continue to follow Spike because of his uncanny and very Prince and the Pauper resemblance to the boy king of Petrania. The Petranian spies are afraid to be seen and recognized, so one kidnaps Spike while disguised. Spike's black and racist caricature friend Pincus sees the abduction and rides on the back of the car. The car heads all the way to a seaport to take them to Petrania, which Pincus stows aboard. While crossing the Atlantic, Pincus has to steal food from the ship's kitchen, and the cook, an equally racist caricature of an Asian, is convinced there's a ghost on board. Spike Spalding is only the object of this dull, uncreative feature, not its star. That is definitely Pincus. In the wake of the Wander, Slim and Jake are unemployed until they agree to set sail for the South Seas with Captain Grimm aboard the Wander. Slim and Jake become suspicious that Grimm might have sinister plans, probably because of that name, but then come across what appears to be an abandoned ship. Boarding it, Grimm and Slim kill a snake in a box, guarding a journal entry about a mysterious island where most of the crew disappeared. Then they find the last crew member, who raves about bird claws and death that leaves no mark. 3 men against a mystery island seems poor odds, but they encounter a second ship, whose captain is equally as intrigued about the island and agrees to pool men to explore it. Grimm leads everyone to an old blockhouse on the island where they will spend their first night, but they hear native drums from the other side of the island, and then their lone guard goes missing. Everyone fans out into the jungle to search for him, and Grimm hears about a suspect from a neighboring island, a man named Dienel. I'm guessing that's Dutch or something. Grimm and Holcomb from the other ship are charged at by what appears to be as many as 17 spear-wielding natives when the natives suddenly start dropping like ninepins. The death that leaves no mark has struck again. While at first it seemed like Slim and Jake were going to be our point of view main characters, they are largely forgotten by issue 6 and Captain Grimm is firmly the star. Of the 4 features I just summarized, In the Wake of the Wanderer was my favorite. Captain Grimm is a good name for a main character who we don't know is a hero or not, and the mystery of how people are dying on the island is, at least up to this point, compelling. Comics.org credits this feature, both the art and the writing, to Tom Cooper. Tom was born in Scotland but had been living in New York for 15 years and had been drawing art for pulp novels for the last 10. He was really more interested in being a painter and had been exhibiting art when he took on the task of making features for Major Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson, either as a favor to Malcolm or just for more side income. I'm not sure what evidence the scholars on that site have that Tom, who had no previously known writing experience, and not Malcolm wrote this feature, but the influence from the pulps is strong. I would dare say there's a little Jules Verne influence here too if you see Captain Grimm as a more mundane stand-in for Captain Nemo. South Seas adventure is a genre we're going to see a lot more of going forward. It's unfortunately a genre that relies heavily on the native islanders being treated as savages or outright villains. Like with Spike Spalding, reading these old stories or these old adventures requires turning either a blind eye or an understanding gaze onto these stereotypes, caricatures, and outright racism that were just standard at the time and are unacceptable to us today. Tom Cooper would leave comic books forever in just a few years to take up painting full time, but with the 6th issue of New Fun, Malcolm had 2 new creators working for him that would soon become the 2 most important creators in the history of comic books. They debuted 2 new features in the same issue, a Three Musketeers-inspired strip called Henri Duval and Dr. Occult, the Ghost Detective. Like so many in these early pre-superhero days, Dr. Occult was inspired by a pulp fiction character, in this case, Carnacki the Ghost Finder, an occult detective. And those 2 creators were Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. Jerry and Joe were 2 young men. Jerry had just turned 21, living in Cleveland, Ohio. They were both too poor to attend college, worked odd jobs, and spent every dime they could spare on novels, particularly science fiction, that being their main passion. Their only published work to this point was a sci-fi fanzine they made themselves that had a small circulation. They were desperate to be professionally employed making comic strips, since Jerry could write and Joe could draw. Remember, making comic books was still not a career goal at this time. Even years later, when comic books were finally successful, it was still seen as a stepping stone to break into comic strips, where the real money was. One day, Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson received an envelope with some very unusual cold submissions inside. The comic strip samples were drawn on the back of wallpaper. Jerry and Joe had been too poor to buy good paper. The samples were not of Superman. Remember, we are still T-minus 2.5 years to the debut of Superman. They already actually had the idea for Superman, but they sensed that this was their golden apple and they were saving it for comic strip syndication. Now, it makes sense that Malcolm still was impressed with what he saw. Both first-page installments in this issue begin not with setup, but jumping boldly into action. And Henri Duval, he begins his adventure already in the middle of a sword duel. A lady of high birth scolds him for blocking the road and preventing her carriage from passing. After the incident, Henri realizes he never got her name and rides after to learn it. When he catches up, the carriage is under attack by brigands. Henri stabs one and kills him and forces the rest to flee. By the end of the page, he's learned the lady was traveling with the King of France incognito, and Henri now has the king's gratitude. In this short setup, remember this is all one page, we've already seen Henri is a bit of a horn dog, quick to violence, considers himself a chivalric gentleman, more characterization than we get for a lot of comic book or comic strip characters, and has already scored a huge plot development. Joe has clearly researched and used some photo references because everything looks, to my eye, accurate for the 17th century. Dr. Occult starts with an even bigger splash. Dr. Occult is at the climax of a confrontation with a vampire. Dr. Occult's magic symbol, which looks kind of like a Jewish star but isn't, scares the vampire off before it can kill this guy in an alley. Later, that same guy, Sandra Amster, that's a weird name, hires Dr. Occult to investigate because his wife has been bitten in her sleep, apparently by a vampire. Dr. Occult puts the wife under protection, under guard in a private sanitarium, which is a little weird, and then asks his assistant, Rose Psychic, to help bait a trap for the vampire when it returns. Assuming it's the original vampire, never seems to occur to him that it could be the husband. Occult and Psychic are clearly not their real surnames. They are likely just their professional names, their code names, their superhero names, if you will. Joe's pencils are solid, and he's experimenting with inking styles. Henri Duval is done in a very fine line. Dr. Occult is the opposite, with lots of dark shading. The shading takes various forms, sometimes in the same panel, but is always most dramatic when Joe is using hatching. There's another possible explanation for why Malcolm was so eager to hire Joe and Jerry, besides their obvious talent. They weren't professionals, and maybe Malcolm figured he could pay them less, or even take advantage of them. I'm going to table that discussion for now, but it will come up again. And I hope you stay with me until then, and keep liking these videos. See you next time.